From the News Channel 5 Network, this is Morning Line with Nick BERES.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on Morning Line. Nick BERES here on a Monday. We have a very good show on tap for you. I think one that many of you have a great interest in, as we've talked about it before. I posted on it on Facebook, and we've certainly done a number of stories on it. By the way, this morning we're coming to you on the Plus. We're also coming to you on Facebook at newschannel5.com if you want to join in the conversation about the legalization of some form of marijuana here in the state of Tennessee. And as we've said in the past, plenty of lawmakers have proposed legislation with regard to medical marijuana. Recreational marijuana, it's not really been seriously considered here in the state. But medical marijuana, and as we sit here, there have been other bills just this last legislative session discussed. Maybe something along the lines of limited medical marijuana will pass, but still a long shot in the minds of many, even as many other states around the country have legalized not only medical but recreational marijuana, as you know. Not many in the South. The first southern state, if you want to call it a southern state, Virginia did. Beyond that, not much down here in the South. Don't know if it's a cultural thing or otherwise, but it's slow to happen. What do you think? Most people think if medical marijuana went to a referendum in Tennessee, it would pass by a landslide, and yet state lawmakers still do not move forward with it. And again, this is in Tennessee something that's decided by lawmakers, not by a vote. So a referendum is not an option. But to get into some of the details of what it might mean for our state, it's a good idea to look at other states and how things started there, how things have gone, and what it means both, to the people that live there, the financial aspect of it as well, and all. And we've got two great guests joining us. Again, the wonders of Zoom these days. We can talk to anyone, anywhere across the country. We have two great guests. One joining us first from Michigan is Kristi Kelly. She's with us there, lower screen. Good morning to you, Kristi Kelly. You are with Sozo Companies, and I'll let you describe for our viewers in a moment what Sozo is. A few years back, you were in Colorado, one of the first states to legalize marijuana with the marijuana industry group there. So thank you for joining us. Also, Jax Finkel with us with Informed Texas in the state of Texas, where they have medical marijuana on the books there and continue to pass legislation. Thank you both for joining us. And let me ask you first, Kristi Kelly, you were in Colorado. You're now in the state of Michigan. Both those states have legalized recreational marijuana. Tell us first what Sozo Companies is.
Sozo is a Michigan-based vertically integrated company that has cultivation and processing, as well as provisioning or dispensing licenses under both medical and adult use licenses. Okay, so you get products out there and it's marketed in Michigan. Is it nationwide? We're in Michigan right now. Okay, in Michigan. Let me ask you this too now. When you were in Colorado, and that was several years back when this really started rolling, and that was one of the first states to do this. You were a government affairs officer, among other things, were you, at the time? Were you a lobbyist trying to get this passed? Well, I wore a few different hats in Colorado. I initially started as an entrepreneur and a licensee under the Colorado medical framework, and participated as a founding board member of a few different trade associations. My most recent position in Colorado was as the former executive director of Colorado's trade association, the Marijuana Industry Group. And they have been an instrumental voice in both the medical and adult use conversation since the programs began. Okay. And then Jax, again, as I said, you're in Texas and Informed Texas. Tell us a little bit about that background and what you do.
Well, I've been in the cannabis space in Texas since about 2005, and I created Foundation for an Informed Texas back in 2016 to fulfill a need that we saw, reaching out to rural Texans to educate them specifically on the hemp side of cannabis and also on the medical side of cannabis. And so we really focused on education and engagement in the communities to learn from them and to also learn from different companies, researchers, and we try to bring it all together to make something that is cohesive and easy to understand for people in Texas. All right, well, let's start with you. I like that, cohesive and easy to understand. What did you find is some of the greatest hurdles as we face this in the state of Tennessee? You may have heard in the opening, I think if there was a referendum on medical marijuana here, it would likely pass, but state lawmakers still are very, very slow to move. I don't know if there's a stigma or what is it? What is it that it takes to get past that? And as I've said, I don't see recreational marijuana
marijuana on the horizon anytime soon here in this state, but medical marijuana perhaps. What are the stumbling blocks, and how did you overcome them?
Well, for us, there was a lot of fear and stigma around the plant, unfortunately. And so it really took a lot of education for the legislators and their staffers, having doctors and patients going and having meetings with them. But ultimately, what Texas decided to do was to start with a very, very narrow program. And once they proved up that the program could work, they've been working on expanding it, adding conditions, making sure that dosing it has more flexibility. And so I find that Texas has gone from really not understanding this plant to trying to improve and make a more robust program, because we're seeing how many patients are being helped. And I think that there's this understanding now that, a plant-based medicine should potentially be the first line of defense on some of these diseases rather than the last line of defense. And so we're seeing a lot of bipartisan support. There's a lot of support for medical freedom. There's a lot of right to try type of support in Texas for you and your doctor finding a medical therapy that works for you and being able to try whatever works. And so that medical freedom extends to plant-based medicine as well. And so cannabis has really helped a lot of people, starting with intractable epilepsy here in Texas and then expanding to cancer, muscle spasticity. And what we really find is showing the science on it. There's this misconception that there's more science, more research that needs to be done. But we actually have thousands and thousands of studies about the efficacy and the safety profile of this plant.
And if that's the case, then what was the pushback? Where is the pushback coming from, those who did not want to see this pass?
It really comes down to stigma and misunderstanding. You have to, take into perspective that Texas, and it was either 1913 or 1915, they passed the first ever law against personal possession in El Paso. So this predates the federal prohibition of cannabis, and it was specifically to target migrant workers. In fact, if you look at our statute, it's spelled marijuana with an H because they did not understand how to spell the word. And so we have had decades of this stigma and people being criminalized, and that fear that comes with, the threat of a cage. And so it's been hard work to overcome that. We've had to do a lot of education, but we're just like you guys. There's massive support, over 60% for a regulated adult use market. There's almost 90% support for a robust medical program where really let doctors and patients decide the way that they utilize cannabis. So there's that intrinsic issue in your state and in mine where there's not ballot initiative to address this. And so the laws are lagging behind the needs and the wants of the constituents.
Kristi, I wonder if you could weigh in a bit on that, both from your experience in Colorado first and now where you are in Michigan, which later did pass it. I mean, did you go through much of the same that she just described, and what did it take? Certainly Colorado, one of the first states to do this, of course.
Well, there's a benefit and certainly a risk to being first, and Colorado really bore that and understood the weight of it. So there was a lot of education. The stigma is part of the conversation. There's also the federal status, and at the time that Colorado had advanced its medical program, there was not the same assurances. There was no pattern on how the federal government might react to it, and it was well understood that the federal government was very closely watching the actions of Colorado as a litmus test to determine whether marijuana legalization was something that could be viable on a state-by-state basis or even nationally. And so the emphasis in the earlier parts of the program included the stigma, but it also included a lot of focus around public safety and enforcement and public health, and as well as all of the education on the medical efficacy. And so it really was a very hard-fought conversation with many people. It required a lot of education, it required a lot of understanding, and it required a lot of partisanship in order to get Colorado over that first hump. And as a state, Colorado continues to demonstrate leadership on a number of different things, from cannabis driving impairment and the fight against that, to public health and safety, advertising, labeling and safety regulations and the like. So that was the first part and the first hurdle. But the second part was very much a human debate. And many of us that have had a voice in the cannabis conversation over the years were raised in a say no to drugs era. We understood through all of the cultural influences, or many of the cultural influences and educational influences at the time, that cannabis was part of the war on drugs, and therefore we were raised with a certain understanding about what that meant. And so we had both philosophical and fundamental and personal conversations that really needed to evolve. And what we have seen is that some of the places where people move the greatest are the circumstances where they suddenly understand. I have a friend, I have a loved one, my father is sick, my sister is sick, my daughter is sick. And then suddenly, when you've exhausted all other remedies and you're turning back to plant-based medicine as a quote unquote alternative treatment, then firsthand, it's very possible sometimes to see the efficacy of cannabis in a very intimate way. And that in some cases has helped to advance the conversation, both at the pediatric legalization front and then adult as well.
Listen, we got to take a quick break on that note. You two are terrific. We've got some phone calls and comments on Facebook, and I've got other questions for you. So we'll take a break and be back more with our conversation on the legalization of marijuana and our two guests right after this. Stay with us.